The Seahawks have a vacancy at offensive coordinator, and they've already started to submit interview requests. Which characteristics will Mike Macdonald and John Schneider be looking for as they pursue a second play caller in as many off seasons? We'll get to that up next here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, the host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, and a special thanks to all the 12s out there. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Ryan Grubb, no longer the offensive coordinator for the Seattle Seahawks, and John Schneider, Mike Macdonald, they're already working on finding his replacement. We're going to be taking a quick first look at some experienced and first-time options, a jam-packed episode coming your way today, courtesy of our friends at FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets if you win or lose your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now for your lead story here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Meeting with reporters for the last time for the 2024 season on Tuesday, Mike Macdonald got plenty of questions about Ryan Grubb being dismissed and what the Seahawks are going to be looking for in a new offensive coordinator. And while the details were not necessarily the most specific, Rob, we got to hear Coach Macdonald dish out 4 pillars that he's going to be looking for, that John Schneider are going to be looking for, areas that need to be improved from what they had in Ryan Grubb this season. And looking at the quote from Macdonald today, we've done a lot of great things on offense, but we want our offense to be a physical unit and dictate terms of the defense and play complementary football, get the ball to our playmakers frequently and in space, and let our quarterback play fast. Based on that assessment, that was while he was answering mainly why Seattle decided to go a different direction at the offensive coordinator position. When you look at that quote, to be honest, all 4 of those areas are areas that Ryan Grubb's offense either was inconsistent in or didn't do it all this year for the most part in the 2024 season. And that explains why they are now back to the drawing board trying to find somebody to replace him that can hopefully jumpstart this offense for more success in 2025.
Yeah, and I think that's really well said, Corbin. I think those 4 pillars, as you mentioned, very much spell out exactly the differences that Mike Macdonald was trying to illustrate are basically why the so-called marriage between he and former offensive coordinator Ryan Grubb was doomed for failure. Because, look, as we talked about in yesterday's show, where we kind of extolled some of the virtues of Ryan Grubb's one season in Seattle, and as well as kind of, acknowledge the struggles that he had. There's no question about it. If you want to simplify things, and Mike Macdonald kind of mentioned this in today's press conference, is that it would be oversimplifying things just to say that the Seahawks want to run the football more consistently. They want to be a physical unit. There's a lot of people out there on social media who would argue that, pass blocking doesn't have to be passive. But if you are going to be pass blocking, then you have to be physical. You have to dictate the terms to the defense. You have to play complementary football. As we talked about before, there were some games this season that basically felt like the Seahawks had in their hand, and because they were unable to play complementary football, they essentially handed it to their opponents. That they have to get the ball to their playmakers, and not only get the ball to their playmakers, but get them in space and give them an opportunity to take advantage of those 4.3 speed or the record-breaking change of direction speed that Jackson Smith and Jigba showed. I mentioned the 4.3 speed that DK Metcalf had has demonstrated, that Kent Walker has demonstrated over their respective careers. And then finally, let their quarterback play fast. And that to me was one of the biggest bugaboos I had, in watching Ryan Grubb this past season, is so many times you'd see Geno Smith at the line of scrimmage, and then he and the rest of his teammates would look to the sidelines to make whatever adjustments. That is taking away the creativity, the spontaneity that makes NFL offenses, when they're really humming, start to hum. And so to me, I think that these are the four tenets that the Seahawks absolutely have to improve on if they are going to be having that postseason conversation a year from now.
And like I said, these are all areas that Ryan Grubb, I think you can make an argument he failed in all four of these. There might be a few areas where he was a little bit better than others, but the two that really jump out to me that Mike Macdonald is going to have to really prioritize here, John Schneider as well being actively involved in this process, complementary football and getting the ball to playmakers in space. To me, those are the two that jump out the most, because I think when you look back at this past season, we talked so much about the run game, and I'm not going to sit here and say that you need to be doing 50-50 or even 60-40 when you're talking pass versus run. To me, there isn't percentages, but when you have games like the Giants game where you threw 87% of your offensive snaps, like that is not a recipe in the NFL to have any type of success. And there were too many times late in games. I could keep going back to the Vikings and Packers losses where there wasn't a complementary offense that was being orchestrated by Ryan Grubb. So they need to bring in a new play caller who is going to be able to do that. And that's not, it's a feel thing. It's not about percentages. It's a feel thing. Like I've seen really good football teams that pass 70% of the time, but the 30% of the time that they run, they're extremely effective. And that makes their pass game have a lot more teeth. And so efficiency can be in there, but they just got to play complementary football. And I think getting the ball to your playmakers in space, to Ryan Grubb's credit, I felt like at times he was able to do that with Jackson Smith and Jigba this year. DK Metcalf, though, in the second half of the season, you could kind of read that in Mike Macdonald's body language today when he was talking about DK's season. The way that I interpreted it was he was kind of mentioning that, we got to find ways to get an elite athlete the ball in space more often. And there were just too many times that he disappeared, and we saw the spacing on some of those red zone interceptions. That was a college to NFL issue, adapting to what you could do against the best defenders in the world. So I think that those are the two key areas that in this coaching search, obviously the other two things that Mike Macdonald mentioned are important as well. But if the Seahawks want to get this offense back to being where they think it's capable of being next year, there has got to be a complementary attack, and you have got to be able to get the ball to your playmakers in space. I think the playing fast thing, Geno Smith gets the ball out quickly. That's not what is being referenced there. It has to do with giving the quarterback the tools to be able to play fast and get up to the line and be able to make your reads and not have to constantly look to the sideline. I know college teams do that. That typically doesn't work in the NFL. And you've got to be able to play in rhythm. And this offense, way too many times this year, they were out of rhythm. So you've got to get a play caller that can check off all those boxes here.
You really do. And you have this opportunity here. And that's one of the things I'm excited about is just, acknowledging that Mike Macdonald and John Schneider now are in a position to basically be able to evaluate all of the potential coaching opportunities, as opposed to a year ago when, of course, they basically got a late start on all of this, with the decision to move on past Pete Carroll, waiting for Mike Macdonald to be available for the Seahawks to evaluate him, and so now they have the opportunity, as Mike Macdonald said in his press conference today, basically they're a little bit ahead of a lot of the NFL teams, of course, who are competing for the playoffs at this point. So, again, it is absolutely critical that Seattle makes the best decision here to get the play caller that is going to be able to put them in position to succeed. And then, again, as we just talked about, there was those four tenets there. One thing that Mike Macdonald did not say. And I think that is kind of a simplified version. But I think that the lack of unpredictability with what we saw from Ryan Grubb's offense this past season. And look, I am not looking to throw dirt on the man's grave at this point. Obviously, the Seahawks have decided to move on. But just based on personnel groupings, you could almost predict exactly what the play call was going to be this past season with Ryan Grubb, when they were going to call screens, when they were going to call runs. And that is something I think that the Seahawks have to change. So to your point, you just mentioned a moment ago, Corbin, that, it doesn't really matter about statistics as far as, or percentages. If you have a 50-50 pass to run split, you want to keep the defense guessing. And it didn't feel like there were enough times when the Seahawks kept the defense guessing this past season. I feel very confident that whoever that the Seahawks choose this upcoming season to be their offensive coordinator, that he will have defenses, guessing a little bit more, and then putting Geno Smith in a much more of an advantageous position. Because as you said, he is a savvy quarterback who has been in the league for a long time, going for a lot of different offensive systems. He can read defenses quickly. He's got a lightning quick release, and that precision passing really could put him in position to be successful. But you got to get the play to him quicker than the last 3 or 4 or 5 seconds. One of the easiest ways to allow your offensive line to be more successful is you keep the defense guessing when the snap count is going to go, when the ball is going to be snapped. If you wait to the last 2 or 3 seconds, then of course the defense knows the ball is about to be snapped, and they're able to kind of rush the quarterback with their hair on fire.
Yeah, to me, this next coordinator, you need to have somebody that understands how to be able to break tendencies, because I think that was a huge problem for Ryan Grubb this year. It was really easy to know what was going to be running in the run game in particular, and we talked about this ad nauseum, so I don't want to keep piling it on. But they've got to have a coordinator that has the ability to break those tendencies and put pressure on defense. And it doesn't matter on the percentages, reiterating that you got to make it that the other team respects both the run and the pass. That is the goal. You've got to have complementary football where the opponent respects your run game, and then you can get your play action game going. It opens things up for your pass protection too when teams have to be guarded defending the run. You just need to get teams respecting that again. And there was just way too many games this year where that was not the case. When we come back, who might be the ideal candidate to fill this role and check off the criteria we just mentioned? We're going to start with some experienced offensive coordinator candidates who have already done it in the NFL and at the college level. We're going to be breaking that down coming up next year on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by Prize Picks. If you love watching the game, you're going to love Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy. Whether it's football, basketball, or any of your favorite sports, Prize Picks makes your holiday season bigger and brighter. You can now win up to 1,000 times your money on Prize Picks. Plus, they've been giving away $30+ million in rewards throughout December and into January. When your picks hit, Prize Picks makes it easy to cash out. You can check your money out as fast as 15 minutes. Coming up this week, I've got Sam Darnold throwing for more than 230 passing yards against the Los Angeles Rams. It's quick, simple, and so much fun to challenge myself and my friends. Download the Prize Picks app today and use the code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after your first $5 lineup. That's right, $50 instantly when you play. Just $5. Prize Picks, run your game. Welcome back to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. He's Rob Rang. A special thanks to all the 12s out there. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. And for your second listen, don't forget the new and improved Locked On NFL. It's twice a day. Tyler Rowland of Locked On Titans with your cup of morning NFL espresso. And then our good friend Tony Wiggins from Locked On Jaguars with episode 2 on the day. You're going to get humor and great insight you won't find anywhere else. That's Locked On NFL on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. The Seahawks now on the hunt for an offensive coordinator for the second consecutive offseason, with Ryan Grubb being fired on Monday. And today, Mike Macdonald, this was obviously a predictable question, but are you going to be requiring experience to be part of your criteria? And Mike Macdonald said not necessarily. So they may still be looking at some first-time offensive coordinators. We'll mention some of those candidates here later in the show. But Rob, let's start on the experience side of things, far as proven offensive coordinators that are available on the market or could be available on the market for the Seahawks to bring in for interviews, potentially hire. And I want to start with a guy who was actually out of the league this year. Frank Reich was fired by the Panthers midway through the 2023 season. And he had a 1-10 record in Carolina, but it was one of the worst rosters imaginable. He was put in a difficult spot. I didn't think it was fair for him to be fired. We're talking about a guy that's had top 10 offenses as a head coach in Indianapolis, multiple top 10 offenses. When he was the Eagles offensive coordinator, had great success with top 10 offenses that really can stress opponents both in the passing game and the running game. He's had top 10 units in both passing and running games in his career. And this would be a guy having a year reset to kind of recharge after what happened in Carolina that I have a feeling would be a really good fit to pair with Geno Smith. Or if they're going to go with another veteran quarterback, this is a guy who's had a lot of success with a number of different signal callers.
Yeah, I think that Frank Reich would be an excellent hire. He's 63 years old, so let's just throw that out there right off the bat. I mean, this would be a much older, coach than the rest of Seattle's staff for the most part. But that said, remember when Mike Macdonald and his wife had their child earlier this season, he leaned on the elder statesman of his staff, Leslie Frazier, a defensive assistant, to basically take over as head coach. So considering the fact that one of the reasons why Ryan Grubb is no longer the play caller for the Seahawks is just the huge jump in competition from being inexperienced, at least experienced only at the college level before you make to the NFL jump, then going with somebody who has a great deal of experience as an NFL quarterback, as an NFL offensive coordinator, as an NFL head coach, and Frank Reich would make an awful lot of sense. And just really quickly, because I think that we're going to be talking about some former backup quarterbacks here that may be fits for the Seahawks. Just think about the value that a backup quarterback has as a coach. It's similar to what the value that a former catcher would have in terms of baseball as a managerial experience, just because they have to know everything that is going on. As a backup quarterback, that is their job. Obviously, they have to be able to come in if the starting quarterback goes down, but their job primarily is to read the field and then be able to have those sideline conversations with the starting quarterback. Frank Reich's experience would provide an awful lot of playmaking ability to a Seahawks team that is teeming with talent, but unfortunately hasn't had the production. Frank Reich can help the Seahawks get to that point.
Another former quarterback that I could see fitting in this position, and oh, by the way, a Washington native that just became a free agent because the Jaguars fired him as their head coach. Doug Peterson, I know that the shine has faded since he won that Super Bowl in Philadelphia. They fired him a couple of years later in Philly. Jacksonville, he got to the playoffs, and then things just went sideways because that's what happens in Jacksonville. Some of these organizations just cannot stay in winning mode, and there's reasons behind that. But I still think Doug Peterson is a really good coach. I think he's got a great mindset from an offensive perspective. And he hasn't been a coordinator since 2015, but when he was a coordinator in Kansas City, did some really good things there that led him to his first head coaching job. He's had some really good offenses in the NFL. A couple years back, he had a top 10 caliber offense in Jacksonville, and again, things fell apart there, but I'm not going to put a lot of that on Doug Peterson just because of that organization. I think Doug Peterson is a coach that would make sense, and this would be a chance for him to rejuvenate himself a little bit because he sure looked exhausted the last couple of times he's had press conferences before he was fired in Jacksonville, and I get it. That had to be an exhausting situation. But put him in a lesser role and let him have fun with football again. I think Doug Peterson could make some sense. And a familiar name, Brian Schottenheimer. In fact, I'm going to say right now, of the experienced options, I might be most intrigued by a reunion with Brian Schottenheimer because of the things that he has consistently done well as a coordinator in the NFL. The New York Jets made 2 AFC championship games when he was a coordinator with Mark Sanchez at quarterback. How'd they do it? They had top 10 rushing offenses. The Seahawks had top 10 rushing offenses 2 of the 3 years that Schottenheimer was here. From 2018 to 2020, they had a top 10 scoring offense. all 3 of those years, Rob. I think Brian Schottenheimer was incredibly undervalued as the play caller for the Seattle Seahawks. He's done some good things in Dallas. He hasn't been the play caller there, but he's had his involvement. I think Brian Schottenheimer could make a lot of sense coming back for a second stint as well. With that run game background, he's going to give you that complementary football that Mike Macdonald wants, and they're going to get the play call in, and they're going to get the ball up to the line. Geno Smith knows the offense already because he played for him for 2 years in Seattle. To me, those 3 candidates jump out the most. We're talking experienced coordinators that could be options here.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned Schottenheimer. I mean, obviously the reunion would be fascinating just from a lot of different perspectives. The success that he has had everywhere that he has gone speaks for itself. And I would argue the same thing with Doug Peterson. As you acknowledged, Doug Peterson is a state of Washington native. Next time when we kind of mention some of the different cities out there that we appreciate our listeners, and of course we appreciate all of you, the Bellingham native Doug Peterson, I think that would be fascinating. He's 56 years old, as you mentioned, that he, was the head coach previously of the Jacksonville Jaguars, and of course won his Super Bowl. And so if we are going to tout Brian Schottenheimer and what he was able to do, then certainly with Doug Peterson, I mean, he won the Super Bowl with Nick Foles as the Super Bowl MVP that year. Nick Foles, of course, came in late that season to replace an MVP candidate in Carson Wentz at that point. So I don't know that there's anybody who has had more success with, frankly, lesser talent than Doug Peterson has had. And I do think that you can make the argument that he might be rejuvenated coming back to the Pacific Northwest without all of the pressure that comes from, coaching the number 1 overall pick, a guy in Trevor Lawrence that was, such a much ballyhooed kind of a prospect that he was. So again, I think that Doug Peterson, the fact that he has the ties to Andy Reid, who we know that John Schneider has a great deal of respect for, as he should. But Doug Peterson worked with Andy Reid in Philadelphia as well as Kansas City. So if you're talking about guys who have a long resume, one of my very first calls, if I was in a position to basically recommend who the Seahawks should be calling, it would be to Doug Peterson. I'll mention one other name that not a lot of people are talking about, and I think they should, because as I just mentioned with Doug Peterson and the fact that I think that he helped his team win the Lombardi Trophy, the Philadelphia Eagles had never won a Super Bowl, at least not since 1960 in the modern iteration of the NFL. The fact that Peterson was able to do that, I think speaks a lot about his ability. Well, the same thing with Pete Carmichael Jr., now with the Denver Broncos, previously with the New Orleans Saints. He has 15 years as an offensive coordinator in the NFL. Corbin, when Bo Nix was drafted by the Denver Broncos this past season, I was among the many who blasted the Broncos for that audacious pick, I thought. And now Bo Nix has basically played himself into a conversation. Maybe he should be the rookie of the year. I mean, it was absolutely fantastic. To me, Sean Payton as head coach obviously deserves a great deal of credit. But the fact that when Sean Payton got that job with the Denver Broncos, one of his very first phone calls, I've been told, was to Pete Carmichael Jr. to lure him out of New Orleans to the Denver Broncos. I really think that Pete Carmichael should be somebody the Seahawks are looking to as far as a coach who has helped elevate his players. And isn't that what coaches are asked to do?
Yeah, that would be a name that would make some sense. And I'm going to throw out a familiar last name here. Clint Kubiak, who was the son of Gary Kubiak, previously a Super Bowl winning coach with the Denver Broncos. He's worked on Kyle Shanahan's staff a few years ago in San Francisco. He's been an offensive coordinator previously, 1-year stints in Minnesota, as well as this year in New Orleans. In Minnesota, they were in the top 10 in passing touchdowns the year that he was there. The run game was in middle of the pack. It was a solid, not spectacular offense. And then you look at this past season, New Orleans, the first couple of games, the Saints were scoring a ton of points, and then Derek Carr got banged up. Alvin Kamara got banged up. Their receivers were dropping like flies. And suddenly this team had no weapons. It fell apart for the New Orleans Saints. Carr came back and they got hurt quickly again. They were playing the likes of Spencer Rattler out there. They had a couple other quarterbacks that they rotated into the lineup, and things just didn't pan out. This was a 24th ranked offense, but when you watched the way that Spencer Rattler improved the last couple of weeks, I think that Clint Kubiak is a really solid young coach. He's been in the NFL for 11 years, and he's 37 years old. He's still a really young coach that's experienced. I could see him meshing really well with what Mike Macdonald wants. So those are all candidates for consideration when you're looking at experienced OCs. But as Mike Macdonald mentioned, that's not necessarily going to be a prerequisite to get this job. They're still going to be willing to look at some coaches that don't have previous NFL offensive coordinator experience. So keeping that in mind, when we come back, we're going to look at some of those first-time options who could be on the table for the Seahawks to replace Ryan Grubb. We'll be breaking that all down coming up next here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by Game Time. You shouldn't have to skip a car payment when you buy tickets to your next big event. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. Killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and with their best price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. Want to see the Seahawks next season in the preseason? You can already start to put in offers for those seats right now. And you can also get seats for playoff games for other teams as well. Great seats without necessarily breaking the budget to see exciting young talent. Game Time has deals on tickets right at the day of the event, and a Game Time guarantee means you'll always get the best price to write your own memories. If you find tickets in the same section in a row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time by downloading the Game Time app, creating an account, and using the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast. It is Tuesday. A special thanks to all the 12s out there. Thank you as always for listening in and making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. The Seahawks need a new offensive coordinator after dismissing Ryan Grubb on Monday. We just talked about some experienced coordinators who could be available for Mike Macdonald and John Schneider to hire. Let's look at the other side of the coin. And I know there's some fans out there that are going to say, well, we just had a first-time NFL offensive coordinator and it failed. Why would we go down that path again? But I think you've got to cast a wide net here, especially when you get this silver lining, as Macdonald called it, where you get an early start and you can try to go out and get that next play caller. There could be some really good offensive coordinator candidates who haven't necessarily been play callers, but just have that it factor that are capable of doing it. And I want to start here with this conversation, Rob, by going to Green Bay. And to me, offensive line-centric coaches as offensive coordinators, you don't see a ton of them in the NFL, but there are some really good ones. And we know the issues that the Seattle Seahawks have had for 10-plus years, consistently fielding poor offensive lines. Why not get a play caller who is going to be able to come in and immediately is going to influence your offensive line, being the specialty there? I actually thought Ryan Grubb might be able to handle that because he had an offensive line coaching background. But in terms of NFL coaching, even though he has never been an offensive coordinator that has called plays, if you go to Green Bay, Adam Stenavich, former NFL tackle, this guy has done a phenomenal job in Green Bay. He has turned Zach Tom into an all-pro caliber player. They've got Rasheed Walker at the other tackle position, a 7th-round pick that has turned into a quality starter. Green Bay's got one of the best offensive lines in the entire NFL, and Stenavich is a big part of that. And, oh, by the way, he's got the Green Bay ties. He played at Michigan, so Mike Macdonald's going to like that. I just look at Stenavich, and this guy jumps out to me immediately as a candidate that the Seahawks have got to find a way to get an interview for, because he's the offensive coordinator in Green Bay, but he's not the play caller. Give him that opportunity to be a play caller and be in this system with Mike Macdonald. I have a feeling Stenavich would be quite interested in this position.
Yeah, I think that there's a possibility he would. But as you said, Corbin, he is currently the offensive coordinator of the Green Bay Packers. The Seahawks can put in a ticket, I believe is the words that Mike Macdonald put in earlier, basically suggesting that Seattle is going to be asking other NFL teams for permission to interview some of their candidates. There's literally a six-pack of different current offensive coordinators in the NFL that, sure, I would love the Seahawks to interview Adam Stenavich. I think that he'd be a great fit. Ben Johnson of obviously the Detroit Lions is getting all kinds of buzz as possibly being a head coach candidate. Frank Smith of Miami, the Seahawks investigated a little bit more. Kellen Moore, currently the OC in Philadelphia, who is also a Washington State native. Wes Phillips from Minnesota, is obviously the Minnesota Vikings have had a great deal of success. When you start talking about guys who have some offensive line coaching experience, one of the names that really jumps out to me is Arthur Smith, the current offensive coordinator with the Pittsburgh Steelers, previously the head coach with the Atlanta Falcons. There's a number of them, Corbin, but rather than kind of mention those guys, I do think that they're quality candidates. I just have a hard time believing, just knowing that Seattle has historically struggled to get people to be willing to move all the way to the West Coast, Southwest Alaska, as some people would call it. So I'm going to focus in on some coaches that are not currently offensive coordinators, even though, again, any of those coaches that we just talked about, I think would be ideal fits for Seattle. First, I'm going to mention Josh McCown, and he is currently the Carolina Panthers, quarterback coach, Minnesota Vikings quarterback coach. Previously, 18 seasons as a NFL mostly backup quarterback. As we talked about before, I really think that a backup quarterback and now a coach, that is a level of perspective that very few people are going to possess. So to me, Josh McCown, the success that he has had, again, currently the Minnesota Vikings quarterback coach, I really think that you have to give him an awful lot of credit. And the fact that he's 45 years old, to me, is somebody that his star is still on the rise. I think that he would be somebody that Mike Macdonald would be able to bounce off a lot of ideas from, and be able to, have an immediate rapport with a similarly aged quarterback in Geno Smith.
And the thing that I love about McCown, he was a quarterback in the NFL for almost 20 years, and he started quite a few games during that time. He's played in so many different offenses. He's been exposed to a lot of different systems, different verbiage, and he is taking that into the NFL. And Kevin O'Connell loves this guy. He has been the quarterback coach this year in Minnesota. He was fired with Frank Reich in Carolina the year before. Again, it was a terrible situation. He was trying to work with the number 1 overall pick, Bryce Young, on a team that had very little talent away from the rookie quarterback, and the entire staff just got the boot late in the season. But he has been fantastic in Minnesota, and he's one of the reasons Sam Darnold is a Pro Bowler this year, and Sam Darnold threw 35 touchdown passes. You can't tell me that Josh McCown did not have a major imprint on that. And again, you mentioned he's 45. This guy is highly regarded in football circles for his football acumen, his intelligence. I think he would be a very interesting guy to bring in for an interview and see if he wants to become an offensive coordinator. If you're going to go in the same vein, another quarterback coach, I mentioned this guy last year. We were talking about offensive coordinator candidates. T. Martin, coming from the Baltimore Ravens. I love this guy with the way that he is able to reach his players, the way that he is able to connect with them. And I think that is a big key to coaching, is the ability to be able to connect with players. But the work that he's done with Lamar Jackson came into the league as a good but not great passer. T. Martin has been instrumental in him developing into an elite passer. That's why he put up the video game numbers that he did this year. He is no longer just a running threat that can throw the football. He is now an elite passer to go with his elite running ability. He's as good as we've seen. T. Martin's been a big part of that. Oh, by the way, T. Martin and Mike Macdonald were on the same staff in Baltimore for several years. So you've already got that building connection. McCown and T. Martin, two guys that haven't been OCs at the NFL level, they both would be guys that I would be highly interested in, just with the work they've done with quarterbacks, the connection that Martin has with Macdonald already. I think this would be a really interesting fit for Seattle.
Oh, no question about it. And you mentioned that the built-in connection. So I think that even though Mike Macdonald said in his press conference today that there is no members of Seattle's current coaching staff that they are currently viewing as a possible, promotional candidate to offensive coordinator, still, because of the built-in relationship that he currently already has with Mike Macdonald and obviously Geno Smith, Jake Peetz is somebody that I know his name has been thrown around a little bit. And I think that it's very well deserved. I mean, this is a guy that is a highly respected coach. I was surprised that Seattle was able to lure him from Sean McVay in the Los Angeles Rams a year ago. But he is somebody else that I think that as Seattle starts to wade their way through these different candidates, they may realize that, maybe their best candidate is actually already in the building. So Jake Peetz is another name to keep in mind.
And I think one last name to mention here, we've got to have a Kyle Shanahan disciple on this list, or what are we doing on Locked On Seahawks? Brian Fleury, their tight end coach, he has been a quality control coach in the past. He doesn't have any experience as a pass game coordinator or an offensive coordinator, but look, he's been around Kyle Shanahan the last couple of years. Look at the work he has done with tight ends. My understanding, talking to some people that are connected to the 49ers, is that this guy is a rising star on that staff, and he is on the radar for a number of teams. I look at the work he's done with the tight ends that they've had there. Brian Fleury is a coach to watch for. And, oh, by the way, he's coached defensive position groups in college and the NFL as well. And I think that has value when you're an offensive coordinator, because you have a different perspective on how to attack defenses because you have coached on that side of the ball. So I would not be surprised at all if Brian Fleury is a guy who ends up being in the mix for this job. Even though he's never been a coordinator, he does have that quality control coach experience, and he has coached position groups on both sides of the football. That creates an interesting dynamic that I think Mike Macdonald would be intrigued by, because, hey, I can talk some defense with this guy as well as my offensive coordinator. So a number of first-time options that could make some sense. I think you got to keep all avenues open. Don't just use the fact that Ryan Grubb failed as a reason to completely eliminate some quality candidates who could be good fits for this job. We will see in the next few days. I'm sure we'll start to figure out some coaches that the Seahawks have lined up for offensive coordinator interviews, but certainly some really good candidates out there for Mike Macdonald and John Schneider to consider to fill that vacancy. As always, you can follow me on X and Blue Sky at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. When we come back tomorrow, we'll have the latest on the offensive coordinator search, and we're going to start diving into some end-of-season gray cards for the Seattle Seahawks. Make sure that you are listening in and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Go Hawks.